have the floor.
Gracias. Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, distinguished permanent representatives, distinguished delegates. For 5 consecutive days, from Friday, October 18th to Wednesday, October 23rd, Cuban families had no electricity but for a few hours. They were anxious about the possibility that their food would be spoiled. They knew that it would not be possible, or it would be very costly to replace that food. Many Cuban families lacked running water. Hospitals worked under emergency conditions, and schools and universities suspended their classes. Businesses interrupted their activity. The largest businesses only maintained those vital activities. The economy stopped during the blackout caused by Hurricane Oscar, and that began on October 20. The Hurricane Oscar had a devastating impact on the province of Holguin. The hardest hit was Guantanamo, where a U.S. naval base is currently hijacking our territory. Despite the unflinching and effective efforts of the internationally recognized civil defense of Cuba, 8 people died during the hurricane, including a 5-year-old girl. 2 people went missing. The municipalities of Imias, San Antonio del Sur, Maicí, and Baracoa suffered grave damage. Satellite photos showed a country with all its lights off, and moreover a country beset by heavy rainfall and strong winds. It was impressive to note the calm, understanding, confidence, and the conscientious way in which an entire people mobilized. They offered their solidarity to neighbors and vulnerable citizens, and did so together with 52,000 self-sacrificing and heroic electrical workers. They were far from their families and worked tirelessly to pull off a true feat. They did so together with our party, our government, the Revolutionary Armed Forces, the Ministry of the Interior, and the Cuba's bodies of people's power. The primary cause of the national power system failure was the lack of fuel. That affected power generation and sowed instability. And that was all connected to the precarious conditions of our power plants. All of the above is a direct consequence of the extreme economic warfare being led through measures applied by the U.S. government since 2019. These measures of economic warfare were designed in particular to prevent the supplies of fuel and spare parts and components required to guarantee the technical maintenance of our power plants and electric grid. They were also designed to hinder investments and our access to financing. We have overcome our most acute power emergency, but for the Cuban people, normality includes long-lasting and frequent blackouts that affect the homes of individuals and fundamental services. Power generation in our country largely depends on imported fuel. However, it is well known that the U.S. government has continued to implement a policy of maximum pressure. It has done so in violation of international law. That maximum pressure policy is aimed at depriving Cuba of fuel supplies from third countries, and it is applied through sanctions visited upon manufacturers and suppliers, as well as forwarders, brokers, and insurers. In only 1 year, the former Republican government imposed sanctions on 53 vessels and 27 companies in relation to shipments heading for Cuba. The damage done to the Cuban economy during 18 years of the blockade amounts to $252 million rather. That money that our country loses or fails to receive would be sufficient to guarantee the maintenance of our thermoelectric power stations. It would be enough to purchase the spare parts that would make it possible to ensure the smooth functioning of our power plants and to avoid power outages. The cost of the damages caused by 5 months of blockade is equivalent to Cuba's annual fuel imports. These stand at approximately $2 billion. President Joseph Biden's administration tends to claim that its policy is to help and support the Cuban people. That's what he says his policy is doing. Who would believe such an assertion? We deeply appreciate the meaningful expressions of solidarity with Cuba and the offers of cooperation we received recently from many nations and a wide range of stakeholders. Mr. President, the Cuban economy has in recent years experienced unprecedented difficulties. These have had a critical impact on the well-being of our population. Our people are suffering on a daily basis. Our government works tirelessly to find solutions to such adversity and bitter challenges. This is an unavoidable obligation and a very, very difficult one. The root causes of these situations are myriad, as they may be for any other country. The causes of our current situation are both domestic and also the consequence of international developments which exceed our national capacity for action. What makes our situation unique and extraordinary in Cuba is the deliberate determination of the United States to suffocate our national economy and to sabotage and impose insurmountable obstacles in order to prevent our growth and development. No other country in the world, not even those whose economies are far more robust than the Cuban economy, could cope with such a brutal, asymmetric, and protracted aggression without incurring considerable costs in terms of their people's living standards. The United States is looking to threaten Cuba. They're seeking to state that they will impose deprivation. With the economic blockade against Cuba, imperialism is warning the whole world that any nation daring to firmly defend its sovereignty and to build its own future will pay a price for that rebelliousness. No one could doubt the ability that the U.S. has today to deal a devastating blow to the economy of any country. In the case of Cuba, the U.S. has been doing just that for 64 years. The United States knows only too well that it is violating the UN Charter and international law with such a merciless aggression. The United States is aware that it is violating international standards governing trade and navigation. The U.S. applies or threatens to impose coercive measures against the citizens of any nation, their companies and financial institutions if they trade or establish economic relations with Cuba. Whoever reads the infamous Helms-Burton Act of the United States will understand how this legislation forces the president of that country and its institutions to exert pressure on other countries, to interfere with their relations with Cuba, and to expand its extraterritorial coercive measures and to impose them outside of its own borders and on the member states of this organization. The blockade against Cuba is economic, financial, and commercial warfare, and it qualifies as a crime of genocide. It is a mass, flagrant, and systematic violation of our people's human rights. It is the broadest, most comprehensive, and longest-standing system of unilateral coercive measures ever applied in history against any country wheresoever. What would Cuba be like today had it had the $164 billion of which the embargo has deprived it since it began? Damages incurred amount to $1,399,710,000,000. If we look at how the dollar behaves against the price of gold. Curiously enough, under such extreme conditions, Cuba has built a social program that has earned world renown. That social program has protected the lives of Cubans, and it has not excluded anyone. Mr. President, since 2017, the previous U.S. administration began to impose additional coercive measures against Cuba to ratchet up the economic blockade. The cruelest fact that was in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, these measures were stepped up to an extreme and even more perverse and harmful scale. They even hindered the purchase of medical oxygen and ventilators. It was a political commitment that was announced by the then President of the United States from the moment of election. The policy was designed to undo the progress made in bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States between 2015 and 2016. President Joe Biden, with surprising duplicitousness, has kept intact the coercive regime by his predecessor. He has implemented it fully, aware of its devastating impact on Cuban families. Under Joe Biden's presidency, the losses incurred by Cuba as a result of the embargo amount to more than $16 billion. That means that every day that this criminal policy remains in force, our country loses $14 million. These are exorbitant figures for any nation and are even greater for a small island state developing economy without a wealth of natural resources. That is Cuba's position. The comprehensive report presented by the UN Secretary General pursuant to Resolution 78/7 contains the valuable contributions of 183 member states and 35 agencies, funds, and programs of the UN system. That report is faithful and compelling testimony of the terrible consequences of the blockade on the Cuban people and the island's economy, and the report attests to its extraterritorial effect on other countries. We note the impact of the blockade on the worsening of several essential services and the decrease in supplies that services and supplies that Cubans have actually enjoyed for decades as a result of a policy of social justice and equity. These supplies and services include electricity, health, education, food, water, public utilities, public transport, the production of food and medicines. All of these are services that the people require and for which the scant financial resources of our country are not enough. More than 80% of our people have only ever known Cuba under a blockade. all Cuba's young people have been forced to live in a country under embargo. Cuban families suffer the anxiety and the pain of separation artificially imposed by inhumane measures which affect all of us and which take the form, or have the consequence rather, of high rates of migration. It would be impossible not to acknowledge that the extreme tightening of the blockade is the main reason why a significant number of Cuban young people have decided to opt for either temporary or permanent ways of fulfilling their potential outside the island, and that has a searing impact on their families and their Cuban homeland. Mr. President, the right to food is a human right. The accumulated cost of 4 months of economic blockade is equivalent to $1.6 billion. That amount would be enough to guarantee for an entire year the delivery to all Cuban families of the rationed food basket. That basket for decades has been given to Cuban families, but today it's not enough to meet their needs. But it does meet their most acute needs and is provided at a heavily subsidized price. The blockade's measures ultimately produce sustained agony for the Cuban people in terms of finding the resources that will make it possible to pay for the contents of shipments that come to the country that the people so desperately need. The long-standing blockade has also had a very severe impact on Cuba's food production. This is because it hinders the availability of fuel, seeds, fertilizers, animal feed, pesticides, and other inputs. All of this adds to the difficulties already listed in difficulties affecting maritime transport and the availability of electricity. It is well known, because the U.S. states this time and time again, and you'll hear the same thing said soon by the U.S. representative, that pursuant to legal provisions dating back to the year 2000, the government of that country allows, despite the fact it's absolutely forbidden to export things to Cuba, it allows the exceptional exports of food through license. We're talking here about sales that go in one direction. These sales are subject to extraordinary limitations. These limitations include that of finding credits or loans for any such transactions. Licenses for such exports are only granted for sales that are paid in cash and in advance. Commodities can only be shipped on board U.S. vessels, and these vessels must return empty to their ports of origin. There are needs that Cuba has in terms of covering its people's food needs. Cuba has therefore made use of that mealy-mouthed, narrow possibility in spite of these draconian conditions, but these transactions could actually flower and become true dynamic trade. If the blockade did not exist, the volume could also grow. The same government that authorizes those sales deprives Cuba of the financial resources it requires to import such food or inputs for the food industry from any country in the world, not only from the United States. The human right to health should be sacred. Cuba is capable of producing around 60% of its basic either adjusted or essential drugs list. In recent years, it has been impossible for Cuba to guarantee this production due to the extreme ratcheting up of the measures imposed against our government. These measures have taken a toll on people's lives, infant mortality has increased, and Cuban life expectancy has decreased. Cuba is deprived of some money, a lot of money. Indeed, we would need the money we lose during 25 days of blockade alone to guarantee the manufacturing and availability of antibiotics, painkillers, hypertensive drugs, and many other essential medicines required for our sick people. These include boys, girls, older persons, and pregnant women. With $12 million, Cuba could buy the insulin necessary to treat all of our diabetic patients. The losses incurred by the blockade within a single day exceed that amount. The damages caused by 9 days of blockade are equivalent to the $129 million necessary to import the expendable medical supplies used by our country every year. These supplies include cotton, syringes, catheters, needles, and sutures, among other inputs. And these supplies also include all of the reagents required by the national health system. 15 minutes of blockade, less time than this speech, that is, are equivalent to $144,000 in losses to Cuba. That is money that we require to buy the implants required by our hearing-impaired children and teenagers. It is still impossible to access the medical equipment, therapies, and medicines best suited to our needs from U.S. companies. We have to acquire this equipment at exorbitant prices through brokers, or we have to replace or substitute these supplies with generics that are not as effective, even to treat the newborns and sick children. The U.S. government is perfectly well aware of the direct and indirect impact that its policy has on the Cuban health system. It is only too well aware of the suffering and the anguish it causes, as well as its consequences in terms of incomplete treatments, delayed treatments, postponed surgeries, and scant medical inputs. It cannot conceal the fact that its goal is quite clearly to visit harm upon the Cuban population. It is fully aware of that fact. Mr. President, no government should pursue as a policy a quest to impoverish and deprive other nations, causing shortages. Far less is it appropriate to do so in a small neighboring country that has not enforced any measure against the country of that government. It is a collective punishment prohibited by international law and international humanitarian law. Among the measures designed to ratchet up the blockade that have been applied in recent years, we'd like to point out, because it is so slanderous and because it causes such huge economic damage directly and indirectly, the measure I'd like to point out is the U.S. decision to include Cuba in a list issued by its State Department that arbitrarily designates countries as sponsors of terrorism. In stark contrast, the U.S. government continues to tolerate and show indifference to individuals and groups that organize, finance, and execute from the territory of that country, the United States of America, violent and terrorist acts against Cuba. An example of such acts was the recent release by the U.S. judicial authorities of an individual who, on October 30th, 2020, stood in the middle of the street and opened fire and shot 32 rounds with a machine gun against the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. That list has no legitimacy whatsoever. Neither does it make any contribution whatsoever to international efforts against terrorism. Rather, it undermines those efforts. It is an instrument of political coercion applied through economic measures that are punitive and through threats. The presence of any country on that list automatically activates a series of coercive measures. In Cuba's case, these cause damage equivalent to that of the blockade and add to that blockade. Among them, we can point to the fact that financial institutions that establish links with Cuba are afraid of U.S. reprisals. Since the beginning of President Biden's term, 1,064 foreign banks have reportedly refused to offer their services to Cuban entities out of fear of U.S. fines. Our nationals in several countries have been refused banking services simply for being Cuban citizens. That is deeply discriminatory. Citizens are also deprived of the privilege of the ESTA visa, an ESTA visa that would allow them to enter the U.S. That allows other countries and other people to enter the U.S., but Cubans or people that have traveled to Cuba are deprived of the ESTA, and that is discriminatory. Over the last year, more than 300,000 European citizens who visited Cuba were denied the ESTA visas. It has an intimidating effect, and in order to amplify that, the list of people whose visa applications have been denied are made public. The United States is seeking in every possible way to prevent Cuba's economic recovery. It's doing so by harming tourism. That is a key source of income. The United States seems to feel it has the right to tell people from other nations which countries they are not allowed to visit, because if they do, they will suffer reprisals. As a political weapon, the United States stymies its citizens' freedom of travel, its own citizens, as well as that of other citizens of other nations. The U.S. government is perfectly well aware that Cuba does not sponsor terrorism and that it has no links at all to terrorism. The presence of our country on that list is totally unjustified. However, it is also evidence of the fact that there are no political or ethical arguments which justify the economic war waged against us. The current President of the United States inherited this nefarious decision. It was a decision taken by his predecessor 9 days before he left the White House. However, President Joseph Biden is absolutely able and has every authority to sign at any time a document which would remove Cuba from that spurious list. We should never have been placed on that list. It would be the only morally and legally right thing to do. The international community has, in its vast majority, recognized that Cuba is not a terrorist country. Myriad governments, parties, parliaments, solidarity movements, and civil society organizations, as well as associations of Cubans living abroad, international organizations, statements made by former U.S. presidents, U.S. Congress members, journalists, and intellectuals. Many such groups have called for Cuba's removal from that list. We also recall here the declaration signed by 123 countries. That declaration pursued a similar goal at the Human Rights Council. Mr. President, over the course of this last year, the U.S. government has announced several measures that it presents to the public as supposed mitigating measures, palliatives for the economic blockade. Don't fool yourselves, they are not. The US is obviously pursuing a political goal, and in so doing, it enacted exceptions within the broad range of prohibitions and reprisals. Supposedly, in so doing, the US government intended to offer opportunities to the private sector of the Cuban economy. This is a sterile and deceitful move. None of these measures are actually practically in force, and they happen to be inapplicable. Small individual entrepreneurs in Cuba also suffer the consequences of the blockade, as do the rest of the population. The alleged opportunities spoken of by the US clash with regulations and prohibitions already in place that are designed to paralyze the Cuban economy as a whole. Our government promotes the harmonious development of all forms of management. These include private or state-owned small and medium-sized enterprises. There is only one Cuba, and there is only one Cuban entrepreneurial system. The US has no right whatsoever to interfere in our constitutional order and in our ever-evolving economic model, nor do they have any right to interfere in the internal affairs of our country or in those of any other country. The economic blockade is not only an instrument of aggression of the US against Cuba. It is accompanied and supplemented by a powerful machinery which is toxic in nature and generously financed with federal funds. And it's an instrument of non-conventional warfare. It designs to sow campaigns of systematic misinformation. It fosters confusion. It incites violence, promotes apathy, pessimism, and mistrust. The US has this permanent misinformation campaign in place to discredit us, and as such the US is attempting to cynically blame the Cuban government for the impact of the US siege against our population. The intent is to bring about a regime change, to impose political domination, to promote an economic collapse and social turbulence and breakdown. And they are following, the US government is following the guidelines of the infamous memorandum drafted by Assistant Secretary General of State Lester Mallory in April 1960. I quote, "The majority of Cubans support Castro. There is no effective political opposition. The only reliable way of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. We must rapidly adopt all possible measures to weaken Cuba's economic life. Such a policy, as skillful and discreet as it might be, would be very key in denying Cuba of supplies. It would reduce monetary and real wages, and it would do so to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government." End quote. How long will we let this go on, ladies and gentlemen? Let Cuba live. Let Cuba live in peace. Mr. President, in a few days there will be presidential elections in the United States. The winning government will have an opportunity, whoever that may be, to decide whether to continue applying their failed approach and the inhumane siege measures of the last 6 decades. They can choose between that or finally and democratically heeding the will of their own people. And they can decide to heed the appeals of the overwhelming majority of the international community and allow our country to develop its real capacities and harness its full potential. Whatever happens, the government will find in Cuba a strong determination to defend its sovereign right to build an independent socialist future of its own, free from foreign interference and committed to peace, sustainable development, social justice, and solidarity. The government will also find that we are ready and willing to hold a serious, responsible dialogue and to move towards building a civilized, constructive relationship based on sovereign equality, mutual respect, reciprocal benefits for both parties, and will do so while remaining aware of the profound political differences between our governments. Our people and government deeply appreciate and are very grateful indeed for all the valuable expressions of support and solidarity received. The condemnation of the blockade was one of the most frequently mentioned issues during the recently held high-level segment of the UN General Assembly. Not one country spoke in favor of the criminal policy that has been imposed against Cuba. They exclaimed, "Cuba is not alone." This exclamation is also one heard increasingly within the United States, even among Cubans who live here and their descendants. Cuba is not alone. Mr. President, distinguished permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, since 1992, this Assembly has called unequivocally for an end to the blockade. The reasons behind that demand are today as valid as they ever were, or even more valid. Soon, the electronic screen of this room will be turned on once more, and you, on behalf of your respective nations, will record once more your position regarding the blockade against Cuba. With your votes in favor, you will reaffirm the right of our people and of all peoples to defend their independence, sovereignty, and self-determination without interference and foreign intervention. When you press the green button on your tables, you will be confirming, as you have done on 31 occasions previously, that the blockade against Cuba is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and of international law, and that it should cease. Support for our resolution will send out a firm message. It will issue a respectful clarion call to the current and future President of the United States to make use of their executive power to repair the grave injustice being committed against our people. What that resolution demands from the United States is not in any way that concessions be made to Cuba. It does not ask for an act of generosity, nor does it ask for preferential treatment. It simply calls for the cessation of abuse and injustice. Cuba has the right to live without a blockade. The Cubans are telling President Biden, drop the blockade. Colossal challenges do not frighten us. As Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruiz said, and I quote, "We will continue to endure the consequences of the blockade, a blockade which will one day be defeated by the dignity of the Cuban people, by the solidarity of peoples, and the almost total opposition of the world's governments, as well as the growing rejection of the American people." End quote. Your support for this resolution will also be an act of fairly recognizing the heroic resistance of the noble, proud, and brotherly Cuban people. On their behalf, I respectfully ask you to vote in favor of Draft Resolution L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Blockade Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Thank you.